Hi, welcome to this week's Hagley History Hangout. At the Hagley Museum and Library, we document the unfolding history of American business and technology and their impact on the world. My name is Roger Horowitz, and my job at Hagley is to be the director of the Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society. For this series, we'll draw on Hagley's extensive research collections to tell you surprising stories about our past. Now, for our story today, I want to share with you something that is deep from the Hagley archives, something that you might not expect to know from what we do here at Hagley. And here we are. One of the things we have in our archives are the records of business people whose firms and have activities have made an impact upon our nation and indeed upon the world. And of course, one of those companies that we have materials about is the DuPont company. That's such an important company in Delaware, and a place that many people worked at, and of course many people knew about. In that collection, we have the records of Irving Shapiro, who's best known for having been CEO of the DuPont company in the last half of the 1970s. What I'm looking at, though, is a relatively unknown portion of his activities, one which is very quiet, and one which I think is also very significant. And that's his role addressing the boycott against Israel that was led by the Arab League in the 60s and 1970s and 1980s, for which his influence and impact is scarcely realized. And I want to suggest that Shapiro, by doing this, is one of these quiet heroes that we think a lot of in our world, but often don't really see. We, of course, recognize the contributions of the police officers, the firefighters, the rescue workers who deal with true emergency, the soldiers who go into battle to help protect our interests. And nowadays, in the midst of this virus, the doctors, the nurses, all the people on the front lines of fighting this new war against this virus, which threatens to shut down our country. Well, we need to recognize also the small heroes, the quiet heroes, the heroes who are significant because they have the training and they have the skill, and the moment lands where those skills and that training allows them to make a difference. And in this case, I want to suggest that Irving Shapiro is one of those quiet heroes. He was that guy. He was the guy who had the connections and the knowledge to step in when literally no one else was able to do so. And I think it's the case that his role in this is not appreciated. So that's let me dig into this closely, dig in deeper. And I want to tell you what I found, looking principally in these records of the Hagley archives, but also by giving a little bit more research out there in the wider world. Now let me tell you a little bit about Irving Saul Shapiro. He was born on July 15th in Minneapolis, Minnesota. He was the eldest of three sons, Lithuanian Jewish immigrants, classic Jewish immigration story. He goes to the University of Minnesota, receives a Bachelor of Science degree in 1939 and a law degree in 1941. He immediately lands in the federal government. This is during World War II, of course. He works for the Office of Price Administration and then the Department of Justice in the course of the war year and the immediate post-war era. He joins the DuPont company in 1951. He's hired into the antitrust division of the legal department. And he plays a huge role in the suit that the DuPont company is involved in from 57 to 65 for its influence in the DuPont, in the General Motors company. At the end, they have to divest their holdings. During this period of time, he impresses his superiors at DuPont. He rises inside the firm. In 1970, he's elected senior vice president, joins the executive committee of DuPont, and then in 1974, Shapiro was elected chairman and CEO, succeeding Charles McCoy. This is described by Business Week as a management leapfrog at DuPont. He's really an outsider to the DuPont family, and no small wonder, he is a Jew, the first Jew to occupy senior management positions in the DuPont company. Indeed, this is a story that's remarked upon in the literature on Jewish studies as a sign of the acceptance of Jews finally at the top levels of corporate America. And the business press, of course, comments on this. It's very significant. And he becomes very quickly in efforts to lead not just DuPont, but the business community. He helps form something called the Business Roundtable in 1974, which is a group of business leaders, all major firm leaders who were involved in trying to influence politics in Washington. Now, let's stop for a minute, since we're going to come back to 1974 in a little bit, and we'll focus on the 70s. Let's remember what was going on in the early 1970s and mid-1970s. We often can forget, or maybe not appreciate, just how difficult a time it was for America at that time. And this is why business is so involved. We, of course, have to remember Richard Nixon, who resigns as president in 1974 because of his complicity in conducting spy operations on the Democratic Party and then seeking to cover it up. A particularly sordid story in American history. Then there's the end of the Vietnam War, where after being in there for over 20 years, we ignominiously leave Vietnam in April of '74. And of course, here are the famous scenes of the last helicopter leaving the compound of the embassy. Here are the Vietnamese flooding into the embassy in Saigon as the U.S. is pushed out of Vietnam. Some of you who were around then will also remember how high inflation was, 9 or 10% a year, the high mortgage rates. And so there was a sense of America being at sea, being not knowing, what to do. And Shapiro and men like him in business sought to influence the state, influence politics in meaningful ways. They become very close with Jimmy Carter, and Jimmy Carter was elected president in '76. And Shapiro was particularly close to Carter, very active in the Carter campaign. Now, this, of course, is a story that a number of people have written about, the efforts on domestic policy, but that's not where I want to go with this talk there. The Business Roundtable was focused on domestic policy. It wasn't really interested in foreign policy. So it would fall to Shapiro as the only Jew among all these business leaders to try to have Business Roundtable pay attention to the problems of the boycott of Israel. Now, let me explain why this is such an important issue, this boycott of Israel. Now, when Israel's formed in 1948, it's met by a hostile reception in the Arab world, to put it mildly. And the Arab world is determined to halt Israel's success. They don't want it to expand. They don't want it to survive. And to declare a boycott of Israel really as soon as it's formed in 1948. Now, that's perfectly legitimate international politics. If you don't want to do business with somebody, that's fine. But they try to do more than that. They try to enforce something called a secondary boycott of Israel, which I'll explain with this chart here. What this chart tells you is that you have a stakeholder. A, say the Arab world, has a problem with B, and let's say it's Israel. Firm C, target, does business with B, who the stakeholder has an issue with. So what does firm A do? It boycotts C, not because of any difference, but it has as contracts or things like that, because it doesn't like what that firm is doing with B, the target of its enmity, the target of that. So what the Arab world tried to do is tell firms that if they did business with Israel, they would not be allowed to do business with the Arab world. That is a secondary boycott. And they went further. They also wanted something called a tertiary boycott, which is easily explained visually. Here's your primary boycott, Arab world here, Israel there. They're not going to do business with Israel. Here's your secondary boycott. You're not going to do business with firms that are doing business with Israel. But here's your tertiary boycott. You don't do business with firms that may not do any business with Israel, but do business with firms that also do business with Israel. So if you have a firm that's selling to a firm that does business with Israel, the tertiary boycott is you won't do business with them. This is what the Arab world was trying to enforce. Now, for good 10, 15 years, this was not a big issue. These firms, these Arab countries were relatively underpopulated. They weren't great places for folks to do business in, and they weren't really such these boycotts were not really impactful on business. One firm that went on a business that was boycotted was a Seagram Liquor Company because it did business with Israel. The Arab countries would not do business with Seagram Liquor Company. But as its head, Edgar Bonfim, wrote one article, since Muslims are not supposed to drink hard liquor, the boycott hardly affected them. This changes in 1973 with the oil boycott of the Arab world against the US and against a lot of Western European countries, where as a way of putting pressure on the Western world to pay more money for gas. It boycotted these Western countries. And OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, became very, very powerful in the enforcement of their demands. As the price of oil soared, there was a great influx of money to the Arab world, which of course generated resources for them to do business with all these international companies. They wanted to build roads and bridges, water treatment plants, build telephone systems. And so these Arab countries began to demand more, ask and contract for more products from the United States. U.S. exports to the Arab world tripled to about $5 billion in 1975 from just a small amount a few years before. And so they became a very important source of business for American firms, therefore much more attractive as a source of revenue, and in fact much more attractive than Israel, which was a relatively small country that was not pouring so much money into these firms. So the Arab countries in this era put more pressure on the U.S. firms to not do business with them. And they start acquiring various kinds of documentation to ensure that firms are following this Arab boycott. Let's go back to this chart here. One thing that the Arab companies would demand is that firm C, in this case, to do business with an Arab country, would have to certify that it was not doing any business with B, the state of Israel, that this line didn't exist. So there was a certification process to say you're not doing business with Israel at all, and if you didn't certify that, you might not be allowed to do business with Arab country that now is purchasing large amounts of material. They also wanted to enforce tertiary boycotts, which goes back to the C, which are these companies. They would ask these firms, these companies that actually had no business relationship with Israel, if they were supplying, say, tires to a tractor company that was selling tractors to Israel. And if you didn't affirm that you were not selling those tires to a firm that was going to business in Israel, you might not get business from Arab countries. This ends up being documented through various Commerce Department records, and a lot of this is going on. A lot of pressure is being placed on firms to prove they're not doing business with Israel by the Arab countries, and it's having some effect. Now, there's also another factor which makes this more scary, and that's this thing called war, where you have this huge war, the Yom Kippur War, as it's called, in 1973, which Israel ends up winning, but puts a lot of pressure on Israel as part of this conflict with the Arab world. So the tensions with the Arab world and Israel are high. The Arab countries are in a much better position to put pressure on American firms to not do business with Israel, and it's a source of a great worry to the Jewish community, which sought to make this impossible, which sought to inhibit the ability of Arab countries to pressure firms to not do business with Israel. Now, this did not sit well with the business community, this pressure from Jewish companies. Magazines like U.S. News and World Reports criticized efforts to halt the Arab boycott of Israel. They said it might hurt the U.S. in the long run. And in general, firms were not really that interested in doing politics. To them, this was just doing business. They would do business with the Arab world. They would do business whenever they can. And it was not their responsibility to be involved in foreign policy. That was not their role. So the Jewish organizations and the Arab and the businesses become a clash like that, where the Jewish organizations are trying to pass legislation in Congress, preventing businesses from doing business with the Arab world, preventing them from doing, actually what they're not trying to do is prevent firms from boycotting Israel, legislation of that, and firms are resisting this kind of legislation, resisting this kind of pressure because they felt that it inhibited their ability to do what they're in business to do, which is to seek profits for their shareholders. Now, this is when Irving Shapiro steps into a mess which is developing. Now, Shapiro, before he became involved at the leadership levels of DuPont and in the Business Roundtable, was deeply involved in Jewish organizations, and especially an organization called the Anti Defamation League up in Abrith, where he was longtime friends with its founder, with its chair and its leader, Burton Joseph, who he'd known back in Minneapolis through Jewish community connections. And Shapiro also was part of the United Jewish Appeal. He's a part of all sorts of national Jewish organizations. He was respected by these Jewish organizations for his leadership role in business. So he had a conversation, a link, and an avenue to Jewish organizations, which was completely unusual in the top levels of American business. He also had this good relationship with other firms through the Business Roundtable, who respected him for his role at DuPont and looked to him for leadership in how business could influence American politics. He was, as I would say, he was that guy. He was the person with the package and the credentials to talk to both business and the Jewish organizations and to bring them together. So that's what he did. He generated a way in which business organizations and these Jewish organizations could talk in quiet about how to address this issue of the Arab boycott. One thing that he does is organize meetings that are not covered by the press, that are just for these organizations to share information. And part of what's going on here is educating the business people, these people who are not Jewish, why these Jewish organizations were so concerned about the Arab boycott of Israel and the threat that they felt could pose to the existence of the Jewish state. And they also was trying to impress upon these Jewish organizations what businesses' concerns were, why they might be afraid of legislation, broad legislation, that would restrict their ability to respond to the demands of the countries in which they do business. He tries to diffuse this confrontation. And this is what, I won't go through all the details, but his papers are full of letters and telegrams and records of conversations as he tries to take these two sides and bring them together. At the beginning of 1977, that is, he organizes a meeting at the offices of the Seagram Company in New York City. Of course, Seagram is run by a Jewish family, and it's a place where they can bring people together. At this meeting, he has all the major leaders of Jewish organizations, as well as business leaders, people like David Rockefeller, chairman of Chase Manhattan Bank, George Shultz, chairman of Bechtel, and the presidents or the chairmen of General Mills, Exxon, General Electric, General Motors, and Mobil Oil, and plenty of other big firms as well. And they spend the day having a conversation about how both sides look at the issue and what the basis for compromise might be. And there's all this information in this particular, about this particular meeting in his papers. This generates, of course, assignments of staff members to work out some sort of agreement, some sort of framework for business and Jewish organizations to respond to the pressures of the Arab boycott. In March, they released a joint statement, principles referring to the boycott legislation, which intended to guide a legislative process for how to address these issues. And they agreed on a number of principles. That there should be no discrimination against individuals who comply with the boycott. No American firms should refrain from doing business with Israel or with another firm in order to comply with a foreign boycott. And they essentially, with these measures, banned the secondary and the tertiary boycott against firms that ignored the Arab boycott and did business with Israel. And this meant, for example, that the legislation, which is eventually adopted, prohibits compliance with negative certification, as it was called, certification to Arab countries that they were not doing business with Israel. So this is the framework that they do that. It becomes very complicated legislation. There are some very complicated issues. One is whether foreign subsidiaries are covered. Another is whether firms could identify which companies could serve as suppliers. These become all tangled in a very complex set of objections that almost derail the whole process. One of the more amazing things in the archives is the BRT, which is the Business Roundtable, members' objections to statement of principles. That is to say, the statement of principles of this joint committee of the Business Roundtable leadership and the Jewish organizations. And what I have right here is a picture of the documents from that file, showing some of the objections, the telegrams, the express mail sent in by firms who object to any legislative effort to inhibit the effectiveness of the Arab boycott. They just thought this was un-American. So Shapiro has to quell that campaign. Then he also has to quell the campaign of the Anti Defamation League, who learns about this and it says, oh, we're going to go public. We're going to talk about how the business is backing away from this, how business doesn't support Israel. He calms that down. He keeps everything quiet. And eventually they're able to figure this out and essentially bridge these divisions in the legislation. Now, it's really clear from this that it's Shapiro who holds this very fragile coalition together. This is a letter that Cyrus Vance sends him. Cyrus Vance, at the time, Secretary of State. He writes, in my opinion, your effort is of great service to all of those who deal with boycott problems and who are interested in resolving these problems in accordance with generally acceptable American principles and standards of conduct. He gets a letter from the Secretary of the Treasury, Michael Blumenfeld, saying something very similar. And he says to Shapiro, quote, "The President," that's Carter, "and I place great value in your joint effort with the Anti Defamation League to assist in the development of the legislation which will deal effectively with the Arab boycott." His efforts bear fruit where the legislation passes Congress in May of 1977, and in response to many of the concerns that are there. Now, what's interesting is that a year after this passes, this happens. The Camp David Accords, where Anwar, Sadat, Jimmy Carter, and Menahem Begin meet at the Camp David retreat of the president and sign the accord that ends the war between Egypt and Israel and starts opening up a fragile path towards Mideast peace, a path which has not happened, but was a great hope at the time. This is, of course, September of 1978. And what happens to this legislation? Its aftermath. Does this work or not? And I've tried to look at this, whether this takes place. And we have to move past this moment of the late 1970s to see if it's effective. And I think it is. There is a large amount of evidence of heavy enforcement by the U.S. Justice Department against firms which violated the legislation. And they violated this legislation when they started to accede to the demands of the Arab countries to boycott Israel. A number of banks are fined for violating this legislation, including Bank of America, Bank of New York, and Citibank. Citibank is fined $300,000 for violating this legislation. And a number of other banks are fined totaling $500,000. There's also measures against Safeway department stores and Baxter Medical Supply for violating these rules. Safeway, they tried to open up chains, stores in the Arab world on the condition that they would close their Israeli branches, which they did. They're fined $1 million for closing their Israeli stores. Baxter's was especially egregious. They wanted to sell their medical supplies in Syria and were required to close a manufacturing plant that they had in Israel, which they did to allow themselves access to the Syrian market. They were fined $500,000, the main company, and the subsidiaries were fined $6 million for violating these rules limiting acceptance of the boycott. So by the 1990s, the Arab boycott is not what it once was. And all sorts of firms active in Israel are in fact active in the Arab world. Coca-Cola, Ford, Honda, and Toyota. And so the boycott really fades away as a result of this persistence. Now, Shapiro retires in early 1980s. This is before this evidence I've just described. He's lauded throughout industry for his outstanding role, especially his influence on the government and trying to forge businesses' activities around it. And he received a final testimonial from Edgar Bronfman, the senior leader of Seagram, who writes in the New Republic that Shapiro was responsible for untying the tangled knot of disagreement, which prevented business and Jewish organizations from working together. And he said, I think in very strong words, quote, "Compromise is often used in our society as a derogatory word, but is the essence of a democratic system. And the compromise within the framework of much sought American morality is what good public policy is all about." That, of course, is a good statement for what Irving Shapiro accomplished, and frankly, in my humble opinion, is a statement about what we should be doing in America these days. Thank you very much for listening and for listening in on Hagley History Hangout. We will have more episodes coming up. We'll put these up about weekly. They're available on YouTube, Facebook, and Hagley has its own resource page for those who are staying at home through this storm of a virus. To get to that page, you can go to www.hagley.org/from home. Thank you again. Stay safe.